Dialogue is a collaboration between WOSU Public Media and the John Glenn College of Public Affairs that's developed into a robust speaker series featuring top names in media, politics, and current affairs discussing the issues impacting our community and our nation. Our topic tonight is Election 2020, Making Our Votes Count. Joining me for our discussion is Jen Miller, Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio, and Ned Foley, Director of Election Law at Ohio State's Moritz College of Law. So let's start with a big question. Why is this an election like no other? What's different and distinct about this election? And Ned, let's start with you.
Sure, well, thanks. Two reasons, I think, primarily. One is the pandemic, obviously. I think COVID is causing logistical challenges on voting administrators that are unprecedented. Just the rise of vote by mail, and also poll workers running an election safely, where we expect high turnout. It's just, again, it's an administrative task that is unprecedented. But beyond that, I say we have a democracy challenge as well. Both sides feel that the stakes this year are, again, unprecedented. And this would have been true even without COVID. We hear the two presidential candidates talking as if it's the most important election of our lifetimes. Maybe we've heard that in the past, but they're saying that the country, the future of the country, depends on their winning. And the country that they love won't be recognizable if the other side wins. Existential is a word that we hear with respect to the stakes. That makes it very hard for the whole system to work, because every election has only one winner, and you can't have two winners. And if both sides feel that they must win, how do we end the election where we have closure and the acceptance that the result is something that the country can accept and move forward with? So I'd identify those two reasons as what makes this year like no other.
Great. Thanks, Ned. Jen, any thoughts from you on what makes this election so distinct and different from others?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, first off, we have a perfect storm of high turnout, lots of participation, and a global pandemic. Just to kind of back up, Ned started with this point. A lot of voters are rethinking how they vote. We're going to have so many Ohioans who have never voted absentee before, or maybe they've never voted early. And there are different logistics for each kind of voting. So they are kind of relearning how they do things. We have massive changes to polling locations on election day. We always have changes to polling locations, but more than ever because of the pandemic. We also have our boards of elections really rethinking or having to retool in some ways. So in thinking about poll workers, we need to recruit a new crop. A large majority of our poll workers are seniors or immunocompromised. And so we've needed to not just recruit, but train an entire new crop. They have larger amounts of absentee balloting than ever. So they're getting new equipment to sort the mail, flatten the mail, so every aspect of this election logistically has some new considerations. In Ohio, how you vote really hasn't changed. We've had three options, but just as voters think about which way they want to vote, that means voters, voter advocates, and election officials all need to kind of work on these logistics together to make sure no voters fall through the cracks.
So you both made a very credible case that this is an incredibly important election and one that has intricacies that are different and novel. But the evidence suggests that neither side trusts the integrity of the election system. We've had a president, President Trump, who on not one but multiple occasions has called into question at least one of those forms of participating, the ballots that come through the mail, absentee ballots. And we've heard Vice President Biden, the other candidate, say that the president is going to steal this election. And it's not, this sense of worry is not unique to the two running for office. Gallup World Poll on Elections, a credible polling organization, has found that over 60% of Americans do not trust or have confidence in the honesty of the election system. So why don't Americans trust the election system? Let's start with you, Jen.
I think there's always been nervousness around elections. You know, on one side, we'll often hear a fear that machines will get hacked. Clearly, after 2016, we know there was some sort of foreign interference. There can be bad actors, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit later as well, that are third parties that set out to confuse voters. And so I think there has always been those kinds of concerns. The great news in Ohio is that we have really strong protocols in place. And I hope that we'll get to talk about that more, but let's keep in mind that boards of elections are run by Republicans and Democrats. Every aspect of the election, from preparing ballots, mailing out ballots, storing ballots, setting up machines, auditing the results, are done by bipartisan teams in public ways. And additionally, I will give credit to Secretary LaRose for pushing harder on cybersecurity and just general security protocols. We've really updated those here in Ohio recently.
Just to clarify for everyone who's out there, that would be Secretary of State Frank LaRose here in Ohio, whose responsibility is to oversee the integrity of the election system. So, Ned, what's your sense as to why do Americans, those voting and those running for office, not have great confidence in the electoral system?
Well, I think unfortunately there's a lot of public misunderstanding about how the electoral system works. And again, when you hear things about Russian interference, Russia definitely tried to interfere, but they were not successful in changing any vote counts as far as any evidence is concerned. And I think we need an evidence-based approach to this. I mean, elections only work on the understanding that, you know, there are going to be these votes that get cast on ballots, and we numerically have to count them. So we have to trust the process at a basic level, and only distrust it if there's sufficient evidence to be concerned. That's why we have audits. That's why we have recounts. That's why we have what Jen was talking about, the fact that both Republicans and Democrats look over each other's shoulders in a very bipartisan way to make sure that it's all on the up and up, as it is here in Ohio. So I think there is robust protections that should cause voters to have a basic level of confidence. I do think some of this is inevitable. The public opinion shows that you tend to trust the system when your candidate prevails and distrust it if your candidate lost. You're going to win some and lose some over the course of a lifetime of voting. You can't guarantee that your side's going to prevail in each and every election. I've been looking at this for a long time now, as I know Jen has, and the system is essentially operates the same whether the Republicans come out ahead one year or the Democrats come out ahead the other year. So I think voters should have confidence that it is a robust system.
So over the last several election cycles, we've been getting a bit of an exercise in civics, coming to understand how our electoral system works. Not something we'd always talked about in the past, but I think one sense of people's concern about the election has to do with the structure of it, at least for the presidency itself, and that's the Electoral College. Ned, could you just share with us in as brief a point of as you can, how does the Electoral College system work, and why is it that when we're electing a president, we don't just do a national majoritarian vote count across all eligible American voters?
Well, as to the last part of that question, I think many Americans would like that. Again, public opinion polling has said that there's a strong preference to move to what's called a national popular vote. But amending the Constitution is so hard that preference has never been able to be put into the Constitution, despite attempts over the last half century. So we're kind of stuck with the system our Constitution has, and that is this Electoral College. It goes back to the founding of the Constitution. It got revised once in a big way after the election of 1800. If any of the audience has seen that musical Hamilton, it features in which after the election of 1800, which was almost a disaster, they did fix the system a bit, and we could talk about the details. But basically what it means is that we as citizens only vote for these members of the Electoral College. It's the Electoral College that actually votes for president. And it's a state-by-state system. Each state has the same number of electors as it has representatives and senators in Congress combined, that gives each state its numerical number of electors. And so we as citizens vote on November 3rd in the popular vote, and then that popular vote gets translated into the membership in the Electoral College that meets on December 14th.
So Jen, you were starting to lay out the three options for voting here in Ohio. And in some sense, the Electoral College is 50 different elections all at once, but all conducted somewhat differently. How is it that we vote here in Ohio, and how does that operate?
This is great. We want every voter to make their election plan. That's always the case, but especially in a year like this where we're considering COVID and high participation. So our three ways of voting have not changed. We have absentee voting, which we've had for decades. We have early voting and in-person voting. And so on election day in your neighborhood polling location, each of those has different security features, different logistics. And so a voters need to decide what works best for them and then make sure they understand that process. So for example, absentee voting is the only time that a voter would have to prove themselves twice. That's a security feature where you have to prove yourself to qualify for a ballot to be mailed to you, and then you have to prove your identity again for that ballot to count. Early voting, there's only one location in your county, so make sure you know where that is. If you wait till election day, please make sure you check your polling location, because they always change from year to year, but especially this year, and that you have the right ID. But there are three ways, and if you have any questions, the league is always here, as is your Board of Elections, to help you.
So I just want to remind everyone that we are welcoming of your questions, so please type those in the chat and we'll get to those soon. You know, you've both done a great job of first describing the structure and the process, and then explaining all the safeguards that are in there to make sure that the vote has integrity. But again, both sides are concerned, but they're concerned in different ways. And so one side is concerned about fraud. So for example, we just recently had an instance where a postal worker in New Jersey was caught dumping ballots. What are the most likely instances of fraud within the system that you've described? And what is the evidence that it has a impactful influence on the outcome? Ned, why don't you take the fraud question?
Sure. Well, the good news here is that the level of fraud in our electoral system is tiny. It's essentially non-existent with respect to in-person voting. And it's close to that with respect to vote by mail. There is some small incidence of fraud in the vote by mail process historically. It tends to affect local elections because it happens on a small scale where it does. Again, it's infrequent even with respect to local elections. But occasionally you'll have a mayor's race or a city council race where some shenanigans with respect to the collection of absentee ballots will be inappropriate. In North Carolina, a couple of years ago, there was a congressional election in a particular locality that was affected in this way. It gets caught, so it's not a good idea for anybody thinking about doing it. You know, and if you do it, it's a crime. And so there are, again, safeguards in place that are capable of detecting it. But we have not seen a statewide race in American history affected by even vote by mail fraud, you know, for over a half a century or more. So, so I think people should be confident that something like a presidential election, whether here in Ohio or around the country, it's just not going to be compromised by the problem of fraud.
So I just want to follow up just a little bit on that. Given, again, how much concern and how much we've heard both from the candidates and from the larger populace about this, what gives you confidence, given the high volume of what we expect in terms of absentee balloting, that itself won't cause an increase in fraud for this coming election?
Every absentee ballot has to be verified before it can be counted. And every state, including Ohio, has a process for doing that. So that means when the envelope comes in, you look at the name on the envelope. These are local officials who are doing this, and they're comparing it to voter registration lists to make sure it's a registered voter. They're looking at the signature that the voter signs. In Ohio, there's an identification number that has to be put on the envelope, either a driver's license or last 4 digits of social security number. So these and other ways that Jen can add are ways that the local officials use to make sure that it's not a fake ballot. And so I think we can be, even though we're going to have a much higher volume, we do have experience in Ohio of so-called no excuse vote by mail. In other words, there's been the option of every voter to choose to vote by mail for a decade or so now in Ohio. Yes, a higher volume this year, but the fundamentally the same process taking place just at a larger scale. So I don't see any greater risk that somehow foreign governments are going to invade our electoral process and compromise the integrity of it compared to 2016 or 2012 or 2008, for example.
So first off, let's keep in mind that actually President Trump has said that he's not concerned about absentee systems, which is what Ohio has. Keep in mind, again, that a voter has to prove who they are twice in the absentee system. So the idea that, this idea that you could vote twice, that's not going to work. That's going to get caught. The idea that someone can steal your votes would be very difficult. They would have to know your full birth date, your driver's license number, social security number. They have to know when your ballot was going to show up in your mailbox. They'd have to grab that again, know that information again to prove they are that they are the voter. And so it's just very difficult.
Okay, so there's fraud. Let's talk about the other side. They're very concerned about suppression, and we've heard a lot of that here in Ohio. A long list of things steps that have or have not been taken by various election officials, from the placement of ballot boxes. You mentioned earlier there's only one per county. There's been a big, robust discussion here in Ohio about whether there should be more per county and in different locations. We've got the purging of voter rolls has been something of great concern here in Ohio. Postage on the ballots that have gone out to people is sometimes characterized as a poll tax. What's the evidence in your mind, Jen, for suppression here in Ohio or across the country?
I think there's a couple different kinds. So first, let's talk about third-party suppression. So that's not the state or the local government doing it, but an example could be Congressional District 12, the special election, a few Augusts ago, where voters were actually getting texts that their polling location had moved, even though it hadn't. We don't know who did that, but that was really designed to confuse voters and suppress the vote, suppress the turnout. Similarly, we got reports last week of well-dressed gentlemen in suits on the south side of Columbus knocking on doors, telling people incorrect information about voting with a criminal record, where in Ohio, the only individuals who can't vote are those who are actively in prison serving time for a felony. So that's a kind of third-party mis- and disinformation campaign that creates confusion and can reduce participation. And that kind of suppression is of the utmost concern. And so when someone hears wrong information or they see that kind of activity going on, they need to let the Board of Elections, the Secretary of State, the League know, so that we can address those as much as possible. There's also suppression. You can think about the most extreme would be historically like the literacy tests in the South, in Jim Crow South, where actually I don't know how to pass that literacy test, and I have a master's from the Glenn College, and I am the director of the League of Women Voters, and I've looked at that literacy test and I can't pass it. So there's that really purposeful suppression that we need to deal with, but there's also just ways that the law can be tone deaf for different types of voters. So you're right, if you are lower income, you might not have the ability to pay that stamp. If you are immunocompromised, and you don't know how to access the curbside voting, that's a problem. So our job is to think about how every citizen of Ohio can have access to the ballot, and actually to consider those challenges and improve access. And that is critical to our work, and will always remain critical to our work as technologies change, as the population changes. So are the opportunities for engaging in voting.
So, Ned, I want to come back to you again. As you think about the balance of evidence there are instances, as you pointed out, of fraud, and Jen's just identified ways in which different kinds of voters may be, quote unquote, suppressed by different kinds of actors. Hearing all that, what's your sense about, again, the integrity of the electoral system in the face of, we have instances where people are denied access to the ballot box? How much confidence and faith should we have in the overall system?
Well, I agree with Jen that any voter suppression is too much. A single voter who wants to participate, who's denied the right, that's wrongful disenfranchisement of that particular voter. And we should focus on that, but we should also focus on the system as a whole. The reason to hold elections is to have an individual candidate elected and holding office on behalf of the electorate as a whole. Elections are a collective enterprise that we, the people, do together. And there's never going to be a completely perfect election. There's always going to be some blemishes. There's always going to be some polling places that have lines that are too long, unfortunately. We strive for perfection. That should always be our goal. But the system works if it's capable of producing a result that conforms to the collective will of the voters as a whole. And we should measure success or failure by that standard. Did the system work? Meaning, do all the inputs correspond to an output that is authentic in terms of the will of the people voting collectively? And that good answer, that successful answer, can be achieved even if there's some problems along the way. So you have to measure the magnitude of any problem that happens in relationship to the certified margin of victory. And if the victory is robust enough to withstand some blemishes, we shouldn't discount the entire result, because the system would have worked despite some flaws. Next time, we'll reduce the flaws, but don't discount the capacity of the system to do its job, to identify a winner that the people want, just because it wasn't perfect. Perfection is too high a standard to hold the system to.
So I want to just check in with Mike Thompson to see if there are any questions from our viewers.
Oh yeah, lots of questions from viewers today. This is the topic of this election, is how to vote and how to make sure your vote is counted. Several questions about the mistakes that we've had, the glitches. Several 50,000 homes got the wrong ballot. There are reports now that some households are getting 2 ballots. So what do we do if we get 2 ballots? What do we do if we get no ballot that we've requested? And how do we know if we've received the correct ballot?
I'll jump in. Yep. Look, mistakes happen every election. This is a system run by humans for humans. And I'm certainly not perfect. So I want to back up Ned on this idea that there will be glitches, there will be challenges, but overall the system is working. Again, so Delaware County is a place where there's, not too many, but a couple hundred who are getting the right ballot twice. If that happens, just know that you will not be able to cast both of those ballots. It will be figured out and you will get in trouble. So no one has to worry about double counting. Here in Franklin County, yes, there was a glitch where the envelope machine was not calibrated to ballots. And so the wrong ballot was getting put into envelopes and then mailed out. Those are getting taken care of. The one thing I can say is boards of elections really want to do the right thing. They are elections people. And again, they are bipartisan teams and they will work around the clock when a problem happens. And so the first thing to do is take a deep breath. If there's something that doesn't make sense, you're struggling to participate, you're confused, take a deep breath, then reach out and get help, ask questions. Call your board of elections, call the lead. We take calls we take texts, we take social media messages, as does 866 Our Vote, which is the nonpartisan election protection hotline that the Lawyers Committee of Civil Rights, the NAACP, the League, Common Cause, a whole bunch of our friends work on, and we will make sure that you get your right to vote.
Mike, that's a great question. You said you had others. Let's tee up a few more, and then I'll return to mine.
Yeah, Liz wants to know if we should be concerned about election observers. What's the law there, and what is their role?
So I'll take an initial stab and have Jen come in. I think the system is trying to balance two important values. One is we can't have voter intimidation and voter suppression. Jen talked about how third-party groups sometimes try to sow doubt or sow misinformation or suppress the vote, and that's, horrible in a democracy. And so we've got to ward off against that. On the other hand, we need transparency. I mean, everybody has a secret ballot that you vote yourself, but the voting process as a whole has to be sufficiently transparent so that both parties, all the candidates, the public as a whole, can trust that it's working properly. We talked about how Democrats and Republicans look at it over each other's shoulders on the board and as observers to make sure that the system is working. And, that's in the past, that's gone pretty well. I do think there's a fear this year that aggressiveness with respect to the observation process may tip this balance unduly in the direction of intimidation. I hope not, but that is a reason to be concerned this year.
So we've had some reports of aggressive exchanges outside of early vote centers between observers and the voters going in. And so this is something we need to be diligent about, and something, if you see, please report it. And we're working on that. But let's clarify a couple things. First off, this idea that an observer can go into a polling location is not true. You have to, there are party observers, there are poll workers, there are voters, everyone has to be approved and cleared by the Board of Elections to be in there. So one good piece, even if you do see some sort of intimidation happening, have to stay outside of the 100-foot line of the polling location. So you will not have chaos inside the polling location. Secondly, I would like to break down that I think there's a couple different kinds of observers. So our nonpartisan election protection coalition has observers. We have poll monitors there, and they have, your right to vote. You might see them in t-shirts or hats or masks year, and their job is to answer questions for voters, record problems if we're starting to see long lines, what's going on there, and literally hundreds, if not thousands, of people will be working in the Nonpartisan Election Protection Coalition just to ensure everyone has the information they need, the support they need to vote. Those who are really designed to intimidate, maybe they're asking someone's really a citizen, or they're asking if that person really has an ID. That's not okay. And that's something that all of us collectively, the boards of elections, Secretary of State, groups like mine, have to work on together. And we are right now recruiting clergy and social workers for a peacekeeping force, if you will. And if we hear of really aggressive exchanges or intimidation, we'd actually like to send nonpartisan volunteers out there to kind of encourage, civic engagement in a positive way, to discourage things escalating to the point that voters don't feel safe to vote.
So Jen, I want to follow up on this. Who polices the electoral system? Is it the Secretary of State? Is it the Board of Elections? Does the Federal Justice Department have the authority, or do you, in some role as the Ohio League, have a role in this? Who polices the election system?
The truth is that we all have a to play, and that's what makes our system work, to go back to what Ned is saying. And so as we have glitches over this first week of early voting, there's conversations between the Secretary of State and boards of elections on how to take care of those glitches, between the league and boards of elections. So everyone playing a part. Everyone is sharing information now to try to make the system work as best as possible. Sometimes it's just little things where a poll worker forgets that when you early vote, you don't have to have your ID, you can enter the or social. So sometimes it's just confusion among poll workers, but we're all responsible for this democracy. It's not one individual, so, the president can't call the shots in terms of what's happening at your local neighborhood polling location on election day. And in terms of the bipartisan piece, that's great. Let's talk about it. Every board of elections has to have election officials who are Republican and Democrat. Every aspect of the system requires bipartisan teams, and that includes volunteers who are doing various things. But even that drop, people want to know, well, what happens if I put my ballot in a drop box? That is empty by a team, a Republican and Democrat, or maybe a Republican and independent, Democrat and independent. Again, why? That's almost mutually assured destruction, in that, as Ned said, everyone's looking over each shoulders. But here's the other thing I just want to say. I have the honor and privilege of working with so many election officials and poll workers, and it doesn't matter their party affiliation. We have one North Star. We have one North Star, and we want every voter to have that access. And I really do trust how things run at the local level here in Ohio.
So, Ned, Jen's just given a passionate description, and you did a great job, Jen, of answering all my multiple questions. Well done. So Ned, Jen's described Ohio, but sometimes we sit in our social media bubbles, and we're all quarantined right now, living on the internet, and we hear about things in other states. Is the system that Jen's just described here in Ohio consistent across the country, and consistent enough that the reports we hear that sometimes are breathless and hyperbolic are ones where we should reassure ourselves that the similar kind of system that we have here in Ohio exists in North Carolina, Georgia, et cetera?
Well, not completely, unfortunately. I mean, Ohio does have a better system of the bipartisanship that Jen talked about. Other states don't do it that way. But one thing that Jen said, I think, is true universally around the country, which is the ethos of local election officials do want votes to count. Their full-time job is to help voters participate. And at the local level, that ethic, from everything that I've observed as a scholar of this process, is the local officials nationwide really want the voting system to work and work properly. The kind of polarization that we see, especially in Washington, but sometimes in our state capitals, that's mostly at the state level. That's at the level of the elected politicians really fighting and being polemical. The workers themselves are trying to run a system for the benefit of the public as a whole. And so I think that degree of confidence is worthwhile. The other point is the transparency point. Even if some states don't run their elections as well as Ohio does, the fact that you've got local and national media watching everywhere in a presidential race like this is good, and means that it's keeping everybody on their toes. And we don't like excessive litigation over the voting process, because litigation is expensive and it's costly for everybody. But the advantage of it is, if there is substandard performance happening in any state around the country, it means that voting rights groups are going to hold those local systems accountable and say there's a federal constitutional right at stake, there's state constitutional law at stake, there's the Federal Voting Rights Act. And so I think every citizen of the United States should have some strong degree of confidence that basically our system is well designed to fulfill the functions of democracy, which is government of the people, by the people, for the people.
So in just a minute, I'll turn back to Mike Thompson to see if there are other questions from you out there in the audience. So please keep those coming in. But Ned just mentioned litigation. So Jen, I want to come back to you. You've spoken with reverence about Secretary of State Frank LaRose and the ethos of commitment to the integrity of the vote, regardless of political party, and yet you've sued him. What's it like to sue someone you have great reverence for, and what caused you to do that? If that's something that we should again have faith in the system.
Well, we can walk and chew gum at the same time, fortunately. So here's the deal. We also don't want to sue, but when we see issues that could affect access, and maybe, when we see issues that can affect access, they can affect some voters disproportionately. An example is after the 2004 election, the league brought a law that showed that disability access really suffered because of the long lines, right? And out of that lawsuit came election administration planning, really to plan turnout and then how you were going to handle turnout so that every voter could access that vote fairly and have it count. And so here's the deal, is in Ohio, we work really hard proactively to get the Secretary of State or the General Assembly to improve our system. I liken this process really to the fact that the Secretary of State and boards of elections are experts on the system itself and how it runs operationally and administratively. We are experts on how voters interact with that system. And so there's a lot of times we know even more than our Secretary of State or the General Assembly what voters are struggling with when it comes to access, where they're falling through the cracks. And so we do have lawsuits right now. We have one on drop boxes. This is a place where we really disagree with the Secretary of State. We want multiple drop-off locations per county. We think that's fundamental access to have multiple drop boxes per county, that it's unfair whether you're a county of 1 million or more people, or you're a county with, 80,000, that you're limited to one drop box. And some of those individuals may have to drive 45 minutes or an hour one way to get to it. So that's a place where we disagree. And we will go to court after trying really hard as advocates to make the case for voters. And that's just our work at hand. Like, we will use every tool at our disposal, forums like this, the media, poll monitors, educating voters on where they might fall through the cracks. But if push comes to shove, we will bring lawsuits. In Ohio, we tend to update our election policies through lawsuits. Early voting came through lawsuits. Post-election audits initially came through lawsuits. And so unfortunately, if we're going to have a General Assembly or sometimes a Secretary of State who wants to make access more available, then we will have to do it through the courts.
So Mike Thompson, I'm going to turn it over to you to see if there are any questions from our audience.
All right, don't forget, use the Q&A function of your meeting here online to ask your question. And if you don't want to ask a question and you like one that you see, you can vote it up. It'll rise to the top of the list. One question about poll workers. Jen mentioned that they are training a record number of new poll workers. Will there be experienced poll workers at each location to make sure that things go smoothly?
Well, there should be. And we hope there are. They're recruiting a lot of poll workers now. If you might want to still check and see if your county needs poll workers. It's a great way to see democracy up front. If you have a 17-year-old senior, see if your county's doing youth at the booth. That's super cool. That's a great way to turn youth into lifelong voters. But here's the other great thing about 28 days of early voting. While there are some slight logistical differences, for example, an ID or things like that, we are able to really get a lot of poll workers experience with the machines or with different aspects of security and operations through the early vote cycle. And so it does help us, even if we have a whole bunch of new poll workers, it gives them experience before they really are potentially thrown into the lion's den on election day.
So we've talked a lot about the process leading up to November 3rd. the federal election date here in the United States. And so here in Ohio, as Jen just mentioned, we have 28 days of early voting and absentee ballots that'll come in. And we're very accustomed in this country. On November 3rd, we watch the TV, the video screen, where whatever our tool is, and at the end of the night, we have a sense of who won. Ned, in the absence of a true concession speech from a politician, how are we going to certify this election?
So state law has, here in Ohio and in other states, the process for verifying the accuracy of the vote and the counting of the vote. Sometimes it's called canvassing the returns. And so local officials will make sure that the in-person tallies that have a preliminary report on election night are verified and are accurate. Provisional ballots have to be counted. Those are ballots that are, as their name implies, provisional in nature, so they have to be verified. That's part of the canvassing process. Absentee ballots that are unable to be part of the election night tally get added to the count, again, part of canvassing. And so all of that feeds into a final number at the local board of elections. And then for a statewide office, and our presidential elections are, a statewide office for our participation in the Electoral College, we will then have a statewide result. So that's what gives us legal answers as to who won any particular state. There are also federal rules in connection with the Electoral College. The federal deadlines don't kick in until December. There's 2 dates in December that are important. December 8th, which is a date sometimes called a safe harbor deadline. Congress promises that it will accept as final whatever tally of the popular vote a state achieves on its own if they do so by that date, December 8th, using laws that were in existence on November 3rd. So you can't change the rules for counting votes after they've been cast. And so it's a good idea, and Ohio, by law, wants to achieve closure by that safe harbor deadline. Then the electors themselves meet on December 14 to officially vote for president. That date is set by Congress, and it has to be the same date all around the country. So that's what gives us a final answer as a matter of law. The concession speech that traditionally comes as a way of bringing civic closure as a matter of culture. And it often occurs, as you say, on election night or the next morning, but that's an informal cultural process. The legal process takes a bit longer. So if we don't get that kind of normal concession speech, we're going to have to wait for the law to do its job, which it will do according to its rules. And so it's important to understand that in American democracy, we have these two components, the legal component and then the more informal cultural component as well.
Let's keep going down this path. I certainly won't ask you to predict who's going to win. That would be unfair. But let me ask you to predict the likelihood that we would not know on November 3rd and walk us through some of the scenarios. So for example, you just mentioned the law. We have some experience in the not so distant past of the Supreme Court getting involved in an election at the presidential level. What's the likelihood that this winds up in the courts?
Well, so first, I can guarantee you we will not have an official result on election night, no matter what. You never can have an official result on election night, even in a landslide, because everything on election night is unofficial. For official results, we've got to wait for that certification process that by law has to be a few weeks. Again, it varies state to state, but it can't be election night. So if anybody tells you, whether it's the president or any of the United States or anybody else, that there's got to be a result on election night, that's just a misunderstanding of the process. But what there can be on election night are projections. And the networks will do that if they are confident enough, looking at the preliminary returns that come from polling places, doing their exit polling, their statistical analysis. They will inform their audiences of what they think is their best estimate of what will eventually be the official winner. And if it's landslide-like conditions, the confidence level in those predictions goes way up. And because of different rules in different states, there is one scenario where depending upon what voters want to do, that we may have a pretty good sense early on of what the official outcome is likely to be, but it'll still be unofficial. But there is this other scenario that is also in play this year because of the high volume of vote by mail and the way vote by mail gets counted in some of the battleground states, that the networks won't be even able to give a projection on election night because they're just going to have to wait for the vote by mail ballots to be counted as they must be under state law. I'm thinking of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. If those states become essential to knowing the winner of the Electoral College overall, it just may take several days, if not a week or more, for that official vote counting process to take place. And the networks may be telling their audiences they can't project an outcome without those ballots being counted. Now, you asked about going to the Supreme Court. It's got to be really close in the battleground states for, I think, to get something like the Bush versus Gore scenario in Florida, where, it becomes, the United States Supreme Court being pivotal in the way it was 20 years ago.
So in just a minute, I want to come back on that, but I want to ask Jen about an Ohio-specific question, but I just want to let you all know that we have about 10 minutes left, so please keep those questions coming, and in just a minute I'll go back to Mike Thompson to see if there are other questions from you all out in the audience. So Jen, you mentioned earlier that you have brought the occasional lawsuit against, not you personally, but the League of Women Voters against the Secretary of State and around various parts of the electoral process. What preparation, if any, are you doing for that November 3rd, that post-November 3rd period? Are you preparing in any way a sort of a legal team or a legal strategy?
Yeah, so we are running doomsday scenarios on different challenges. And let's keep in mind that we could actually be suing about an access issue that affects a population of people. And that might not mean that we question the statewide results, right? So again, even if an election is not close, let's say there's a landslide in Ohio, we might still litigate if some people were denied their access to the ballot for reasons that we're really concerned about, and we don't want that precedent setting here in Ohio. We do have a legal team. We do have ideas to what some of those common lawsuits are. So a very typical one would be if we saw long lines all day long, and we might sue to keep the polls open late in one location. And those polls could be open until 10 or so and it not actually affect the statewide count, but we want to make sure every voter gets their chance. So yes, we are running those scenarios. If, for example, there's extreme intimidation at the polls and people are actually afraid to go cast their ballot and they turn away, that could be a kind of litigation. So yes, we are absolutely prepared as much as possible to stand up for the voters. And let's keep in mind that we defend every voter. It doesn't matter their party, it doesn't matter how they're going to vote, it doesn't matter where they live in Ohio, whether they're a member or not. If we are seeing concerns that voters aren't having adequate access or not able to have their constitutional rights upheld, then we will consider legal action.
So again, I want to turn over to Mike Thompson to see if there are any questions from the audience as we near the end of our hour together.
Yeah, well, speaking of scenarios, Tripp has a scenario. What would cause the presidential election to be resolved by the House of Representatives, and how likely is that to happen?
So very small chance of that. It's a great question. The easiest example is a 269 tie in the Electoral College. If you play with any of the Electoral College calculators that are online, if the polls were to tighten or the race to get closer, you could imagine a split decision in the Electoral College that way. Because the Electoral College requires a majority to win in a tie, then it would go to the House of Representatives. But the House has not gotten involved in a presidential election that way since 1824. So it's not very likely to happen. And there's been some misunderstanding in the public discourse that if we have a disputed election that goes to Congress as a dispute, that would go to the House. It's actually more complicated than that. For history buffs, if you want to study up on this, think about the Hayes-Tilden election of 1876, because that was an all-out dispute over who won. But it didn't go to the same procedure in the House of Representatives that 1824 did. Instead, it went to a different congressional procedure where Congress alphabetically, one state at a time, from Alabama at the beginning to Wyoming at the end, that's what it would be today, reviews any claims of disputes about a state. And if you resolve those disputes favorably, one side or the other, you're going to end up with one candidate getting a majority and being the winner, unless you get to that 269 tie. So very unlikely, I think, that it goes to the House of Representatives this year.
Great question from Tripp. Mike, have we got any others from our audience?
Yeah, another one. We've gotten a couple about the Popular Vote Compact, where states promise to have their electoral votes go to whoever wins the national vote. How does it work, and how likely is that to sway the election this time around?
Well, it can't work this time around because not enough states have signed on. So this would be a reform to consider for next time. This idea has been around since 2000, where there was this discrepancy between the overall national popular vote and the Electoral College. And some states have signed on to the compact. More states signed on after 2016 because, again, there was another discrepancy. But not enough states. The way the compact works is that it would have to reach that magic number of 270 electoral votes, and they're still quite short of that. So it won't affect the result this year. If you're interested, think about that as a reform option for next time. There are other reform options to think of, like ranked choice voting, which you can Google and learn about. But this year, we're going to run it according to the rules we've had, for the past umpteen years.
So Jen, looking forward to future elections and knowing how passionate you and the league are, what are things that you are pushing for in the ways of either reforms or innovations here in voting in Ohio?
So the pandemic has certainly laid bare challenges to our absentee voting system. It went from the least chosen option to now a highly chosen option this year, and it actually a required option during the primary if you were going to vote on election day. And so we will continue to work to improve the absentee process, which essentially has not changed in decades, even though we have changes to the US Postal Service and improvements to technology. So things like online absentee requests, prepaid postage, multiple drop-off locations per county, all of those things. We also will continue to work on improving poll worker recruitment. We saw in the primary that we just push came to shove and we did not have enough poll workers, and that's the main reason why we had to can voting, if you will, in person on the originally scheduled election day, because we didn't have enough poll workers. So things like increasing youth at the booth, which right now is just 17-year-old high school students, maybe to also 16-year-olds, increasing pay. So we have a list, Trevor. The truth is that we have always a running list of about 50 things we would love to see happen. And whichever thing we have a partner in crime or a partner in crime fighting at the State House and the legislature or the Secretary of State, we will move forward next year.
Let's see if we can squeeze in one more question from our audience. Mike, anything in the queue?
Well, I guess the question that doesn't really apply to the voting apparatus, but one questioner said, how do we remove the cynicism that's so tied to the election and the election process?
Look, I think if someone is cynical, they need to lean in. It's the option is not to not vote or not participate. The option is to lean in, because every aspect of our electoral process, everyday Ohioans can participate, whether it's being a poll worker or registering voters. Next year, we will make new legislative maps that we hope will improve representation because we will be implementing the Fair Districts reforms of 2015 and 2018 to end partisan gerrymandering. That's a place where folks could be really calling their lawmakers to make fair maps. But I think the more engaged you get with poll workers and election officials and voters, I think the more hopeful one can be about our democracy, because there are so many of us who are committed to every voter and to democracy itself. And that's what gives me hope every day.
And I guess I would only add that our national identity from the Declaration of Independence is based on the idea that government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. You can't have consent of the governed without elections. So it's up to us to enforce that national self-definition, right? Because the alternative is to give up on the American project. And we shouldn't want to do that because the Declaration created our nation in opposition to tyranny so that we, the people, control our destiny. So politicians may try to abuse the process, but it's up to us as citizens and voters to protect the system ourselves because it belongs to us. That's what self-government is. It's ours, and so we need to protect it.
Well, that's all the time we have this evening. Thank you to our panelists, Jen Miller and Ned Foley, and thanks to all of you for joining us virtually and for your engaging questions.
And we hope you'll join us for our next virtual dialogue program. Visit wosu.org/dialogue for more details and look for the topic and registration information to be announced.